Welcome to our panel discussion on open science in sociology. Again, you are still there, and that's really amazing. And as you know, one of the reasons why the Academy of Sociology was founded was to stimulate discussion and a discussion process on how we are doing social science. Social science as science in general, as we know from Robert Merton, is both a collaborative and a competitive system. And from the tension between cooperation and competition, we can deduct a lot of dysfunction, so to speak, in the system. Scandals about fraud, the credibility crisis in science, the tendency to declare all research as relative and therefore prone to fake science, all this challenged scientists around the globe, and one consequence was that many colleagues more and more engaged for open science, as it is called. We will discuss today what open means for us and what are the contexts of open science in sociology particularly. On the initiative of Katrin Ausburg and Josef Brüderl, the Academy of Sociology hosts this panel that is again video streamed, meaning that you should use this mobile microphone if you want to step into the discussion process later. So let me first introduce and welcome the panelists. So we welcome first Daniela Grunow next to me, Professor of Sociology at the Goethe-Universität Frankfurt am Main. She is a brilliant researcher. Today she is invited to contribute as one of the editors of the Kölner Zeitschrift für Soziologie und Sozialpsychologie, a leading sociology journal in Germany. And it's a very crucial topic for our discussion, how journals engage in this debate. So welcome, Daniela. And then we have Jan Höfler, who initiated Replication Wiki at the University of Göttingen. And on this platform, you find over 2,000 studies in the category lacking replication. And you may find ideas on how to do good replication studies by your own. Jan published a short notice on replications in the American Economic Review in 2017, and I think sociology can learn from this. Great that you are here, Jan. And finally, we have left to mind Josef Brüderl, board member of the Academy of Sociology, and sociologist with great expertise both in data collection and data analysis. And he's the coordinator of the PERFAM project and head of the academic council of GESIS. Together with Katrin Ausburg, he brought the discussion on research data forward within the Academy of Sociology and beyond. Yesterday, the members of the Academy of Sociology agreed on principles for research data management that are very much in line with open science ideas. Welcome to him as well. And what we are now going to do is that we have short input statements from our panelists, beginning with Josef Brüderl, followed by Jan Höfler, and then finally Daniela Grunow. And then we more or less want to discuss with you about these initiatives and the ideas and what it really means that we follow these ideas of open science in sociology. So I hand over to Josef Brüderl now for his short presentation. Josef.
Yeah, hello. Welcome also from my side. And what I intend to do in this short presentation, that is co-authored with Katrin Ausburg, as you can see, who is also here in the room, is to try to give a little systematic overview on the issues that are that we have to deal with in sociology to make our science a reproducible one. So the terms are used quite different in the discussion. So I first have to define how I will use the terms in the following. If you want to reproduce some work, you can use the same data or new data, the same models, the same specifications, or new specifications. And if you use the same data, then the same specification, I call it reproduction. If you change something, re-specify the models, then I call it reanalysis. Replication is if you use new data. And depending on the kind of research design you use, you probably will reproduce the work in different ways. So with experimental data, unit homogeneity, comparability of treatment and control group is done by design. With observational data, however, we have to use statistical control, and this has immediate consequences. Experimental data, usually you have simple statistics. We have, with the observational data, very complex statistical models, and therefore with experimental data, it's low-powered studies. That's the problem there. In our realm of observational data, it's misspecified models, I would argue. And the consequence is that in both kind of data we have many false results, false positive, erroneous results out there in the literature. And that's the well-known credibility crisis of our sciences. And here are some citations of other people who see it obviously the same way. But with experimental data, usually what helps are replications, collecting new, more data, checking whether results hold. With observational data, replication might also be useful, but also in a second step. In the first step, usually we have to check whether the complex statistical models are correct. And so for the first step with observational data is reanalysis, and that's what I will focus now, because I am most familiar with observational data. Things are very similar with replications in many respects, but not in all. There are some differences. Perhaps in the discussion we can go into these differences. Okay, so the problem behind all is analytical flexibility. A slide here stating how the way we arrive at our results, it's a kind of forking path, garden of forking paths, and it's not always clear where one should go. Dependent on model specification, Munoz and Young showed in recent work, it's in many applications. Basically, you can show anything, treatment effects, depending on how you specify a regression. In their examples, run from minus to positive effects and zero effects. And the point is, the problem is that we as researchers, we should find the one correct specification, and that's a hard job. Many things can go wrong, and that's our problem. That first, okay, anybody can make errors, but in sociology, as we see a tendency that many researchers do not strive hard enough to arrive at the best specification. For instance, there is a recent paper by Ulrich Kohler who showed that in one of our top journals, European Sociological Review, only a quarter of all authors really justify the specification that they present in the paper. So argue why they chose this one and not another one of the million other possibilities. And that's, we would argue, a signal for not enough effort in working hard to find the best specification. And the result is that there are many misspecified models in our papers, we would argue. And what can we do about this? The best, for sure, try harder. Try to educate people, young researchers, to try harder and so on. But a very good way of a necessity, we would argue, is that we need more reanalysis of other people who try hard to find the best specification. And that's a problem because currently we see very few reanalysis in sociology. You all know this, the incentive structures are favoring new findings compared with established findings. Reanalyzing things. Published papers is not very popular amongst scholars, but also amongst editors. And basically, the incentive structure is one of a social dilemma. Science does not work in an optimum under the current incentive structures. So how can we improve? We all know, okay, moral appeals could be helpful. So I appeal here to everybody who can see me. Work hard for finding the best specification. Implement, do reanalysis. However, as we all know, moral appeals alone will not do the job, so we need institutional change. And in the last two slides, I will present some of these suggestions for institutional change. So what we need is open science, for sure. That's what Thomas already mentioned. Open data, open materials. We just yesterday decided on our Richtlinien, according to which the academy proposes to make data and materials more open in sociology. Another checklist we are working on is on how to increase transparency in a published work. So many people, as the work by Ulrich Kohle shows, are not very transparent on their empirical work. And we need to improve on this, and therefore the Academy works on such a checklist, which also will be out soon, we hope. But for sure, this is not institutional change, it's a moral appeal. We cannot force you to follow the checklist. That's where the journals for sure come in. These are the gatekeepers. They could enforce such rules. Yeah, there are several initiatives on this, but perhaps we should discuss then whether these are already implemented enough in the German journal scene. We see room for improvement. That's the point to discuss. An exemplary open data policy, we think, has been implemented recently by the American Economic Review. These now have not only a data archive, where authors put in their data, because replication efforts have shown what's in these archives often does not work, because authors put in shit. But this guy, the data editor, he tries out all material put into the data archive, and the paper will not be printed in the journal before the data editor didn't achieve to reproduce the tables and figures in the paper. In our opinion, that's the standard where we should head for. And the second point for sure is open data materials alone are not sufficient, because also somebody of us has to use them for doing reanalysis. And so we have to implement incentives that make it attractive for other researchers to do reanalysis. So, and what are the incentives? We all, the carrot sticks that we need. We want publications out of these reanalysis, and we want citations out of these reanalysis. So that's how we are conditioned. So how can we, so we should try hard that journals accept reanalysis for publication. Also, by the way, positive ones. Not, it's also a publication bias if we publish only failed replications. We should also publish papers simply stating on one page or so, oh, great work, we found the same thing. I don't know whether this will work out with the standard journals. That's a point we could discuss probably. Therefore, there might be that we need specialized replication journals. The Economists already have one, this one. Yeah, unfortunately, it's. I think they have only 10 or so reanalysis published so far. But we will hear on this later, I assume. And the last thing is citations. We all want citations, and so we should perhaps change our citation norms insofar as if you cite results of an original study, you always should look up whether there are reanalysis replications, and you should also cite these and report what these found. Then replications will also get citations. And for this, for sure, and Jan Höfler will talk about this, we need also the information that there is some reanalysis out there. And this is not provided by the journals usually, because these do not link often in most cases. So we need a database, and that's a replication wiki. So these are some suggestions of us for institutional change in sociology, and we can discuss on these shortly.
Yeah, thank you very much, Josef, for your description. Applause for this. And I really like the frankness of your statements, what we really want to do, but I have to add, of course, we as scientists have intrinsic motivation to find out the truth, the true effect. And that's the reason why we do, at least to my understanding, these kind of studies. So now I hand over directly the microphone to Jan Höfler.
Okay, while the slides will be arranged, I already introduced myself. I was already introduced by my name. I set up this replication wiki. I think we started in 2008 with the first courses. Well, I did my first classes on replication back in 2008, and we got funding for this project then later on in 2011. I already presented it at many places, but this is my first time in front of sociologists, and I'm very happy that I got this invitation. Thank you. This is the good. If I were you, I would ask myself, why do we need an economist for this? The economists, all they ever want is our money. And yeah, this is an open science presentation, so I'm open about it. Yes, I want money. And I will explain you why. If you want money, you should explain why this money should be given to you, and it's all about supply and the demand, as you know. And so I have to explain to you why I offer services that I think you should be willing to pay. Maybe not you personally, but you as a community of sociologists or social scientists. I have a question to you. Who of you has ever contributed actively to Wikipedia? Raise your hand. None, no one here, I knew that. Okay, so not so many, but some people do. And there's millions of people around there, and since there's millions of people and some of them contribute, it's an encyclopedia that has enormous value. So a small percentage already is enough. Here with scientists, we are all busy to give our expertise when we are so busy already. That's difficult to convince us. So it may not be enough only to have this incentive of intrinsic motivation. The replication wiki is a bit different from Wikipedia in that it has a different structure behind it. A normal wiki is good for text and some pictures to display something, but we wanted a database structure. That's why we have the That's why we have pointer, I guess. Yes. That's why we have a semantic media wiki. We have kind of a database structure inside. And what kind of database do we want to offer? We have a database of published empirical social sciences studies, and we inform about the availability of replication material, so data and code and a description how to use them together, the README. And we have that searchable for keywords. See that here. You can search for methods, you can search for software, you can use keywords, obviously journals and authors. You can search for data types, like if it's a survey or if it's an experiment. You can search if what the data source is, if it's Albus or ZÖP or whatever. And you can also search where the data comes from. Is it German data or US data or from which place? On top of that, we offer the information if there are replications, and so far we have 530 of them. Also, if there are corrections, we have not collected so many of them so far, but it's also an interesting job. As was mentioned already, often the journals do not combine that information with the original article, so you can read an original article without directly seeing, okay, this was already corrected, or in the worst case, retracted. In the social sciences, we don't have many retractions, but there are some. I will show you how a typical page in the replication wiki looks like. So each study has one page. And at the top, we always show bibliographical information. So where was it published, which pages, which journal, which authors. Then there's information about the availability of the data and the code and the README file, if it's available. Also which methods were used. In this case, we don't have that. Here the data type, so this was a survey. It was the US General Social Survey. Then also the time, the place, and if it's available, the information which software was used. Underneath, we have the information if there's a replication already, and what result it had. In this case, there was a problem. They got a different result. That's why we have this warning sign at the top to make people see directly if there was a problem. At the bottom, sometimes you have some additional information. For example, was there a reply? Things like that. So this is the information we offer for many studies. But if you talk to economists, it always comes down to the inevitable what's in it for me question. Why should we care? And there are gains to be had. There are things we can get out of this. First of all, you can get research funding. For this project, initially I got $200,000 US from the Institute for New Economic Thinking. You can get a lot of attention. Our pages have been accessed more than 6.3 million times. Obviously, a lot of that will be web crawling, but we see that from the differences of numbers of accesses to single pages, that some pages really get a lot of attention. We also have more than 250 users who registered for the wiki from all over the world. I was invited to many presentations and at lots of conferences. I had a number of teaching corporations in China, in Canada, in Switzerland, and many places. And you can also publish about it. It's also a research topic, transparency. I published, for example, as was mentioned in the American Economic Review Papers and Proceedings, which for an economist doing his PhD in Germany is not so common. others. What I found interesting is that we were even cited from fields that I had not even thought about before. So I got citations from empirical law or empirical archaeology, who say we have the same problem. It's a common problem in the social sciences. So it's good to have an infrastructure like that. And this is open, everyone can use it for each field. If you're really good, maybe you can even publish in better journals. And some have already done that. There was a publication about how to make replication in the social sciences the norm. That also touches sociology, psychology, political sciences, and economics. And what I found very interesting in this case, the data behind it is unpublished. It was already corrected, but the data is still unpublished. I asked the authors, could you maybe share it with me, at least if you don't put it in the journal archive, as the journal archive rules say you should do. Got the not so nice answer. Finally, I got something at least, but it's completely insufficient. And there are a number of very strange oddities and factual errors in that study. So even if you don't do really good research, it's such a hot topic that apparently it's possible to get in very good journals. But on top of that, I mean, you can get money and attention and everything and fame, what you like. But as was mentioned already, it's the real reason behind it is scientific. The replication helps to better build on existing research. If you have the information accessible, where you can get data and code for previous research, you can more easily use that and see, okay, this was already used, how does it compare, for example, to my study? A lot of us already do replications when we do our research just to compare to what is the existing state of the literature. It also makes results better comparable. Very often you find opposing results to basically the same question. And if you're not an expert, you have no idea to figure out what exactly are the reasons for these differences. Even if you're an expert, often it's not possible because the exact data and the exact code is not available to you. How can you know why there are different estimators? With the information from the wiki, that becomes better. And it's also a very good teaching resource. I mentioned I had teaching cooperations with departments in several continents, and it's for instructors it's very helpful if you can easily see which practical example uses the software that is available to my students, uses data maybe from my country, a topic that I'm interested in. To find that on your own, searching through all these journal archives or archives that you find elsewhere is very tedious. With a replication wiki, this becomes very easy, so you save time. What we need to realize this in the future. So far, I mean, at the beginning I mentioned I had a lot of money and we had students who helped us with this to set up the infrastructure and also to fill the database. We have more than 3,400 studies so far, but obviously that's only a tiny part of the general social sciences literature. And I mean, we have, as you saw, more than 250 people who registered and who could contribute. But most of the contributions we actually get are people who replicated and want others to know that they did a replication, which is good. But it's not enough, because if there's a study that no one has replicated so far, usually that's not added, but it's valuable information what data was used there and how others could use it. And to add that is work and costs money. So it's good that we already have some cooperation, that it's hosted in Göttingen. We have an advisory board with members from several institutions. We have a link exchange with a highly used project in economics. And we are applying for funding with a number of institutions like the Swiss Center of Expertise in the Social Sciences. I hope it works out. There's also an interesting project in France that is interested in us, and we hope we can set up a cooperation there. But in the long run, it would be good to have permanent funding for this, because it's a project that only makes sense if it's there in the long run. To have historical data about what was published until 2013 is at some point not really interesting anymore. But to get funding for the long run, you need really an institution. And one institution that I see is, for economics, obviously the Leibniz Institute for Economics. But in the social sciences, there's also GESIS. And maybe we can convince them together that this is something we should have. If you say you really need it. If you say you don't need it, then you shouldn't. But on top of the collaborative approach that we can do by lobbying maybe and saying, okay, this is something we really want, you can already contribute actively yourself. Everyone can register, add your studies, advertise them, say, okay, I use this data and I use this code, and you can also all use it, and maybe cite me because you see this is interesting. You can also help others to show that their applications are valuable by voting. You can say, these studies should be really replicated, that's relevant to me. If you say that, then others who really replicate, they can later say, okay, it was already accepted by others that this is an important contribution. Well, in the beginning, I thank you that you invited me to join you, and now I invite you to join me. I thank you for your attention, and if you're interested, I also have some slides on the literature.
Exactly the questions you raised at the end of your talk are the questions that we will discuss with the audience, I think. How realistic is it to have all these institutions? Because that's clear, we have to invest into them. And does they make science really better? Yeah? And I'm very curious what Daniela, as the editor of the Kölner Zeitschrift, has to say on these things. So Daniela, I pass it over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for putting me in the middle, because I actually think my role, also speaking for the current state of discussion at the Kölner, is to give a few critical thoughts to this whole, excitement about open access and open data and open do files. And I have to say up front, of course, I can agree to 99% of everything Josef has said, perhaps to 80% of your ideas. But of course, this is something that we need to discuss. This is something we also, I think, we need to invest in and to really professionalize. But there's also a reason why the Kölner Zeitschrift, when we discussed this the last time, and that was at the time when the ZFS decided to make the publishing of do files a precondition for sending papers there. We had a few questions, actually. Yeah, publishing papers. Okay. But that made us less confident that we are currently where we should be in order to go that step as a journal. And as I said, this is an ongoing debate for us. We have it on our to-do list again. But I looked into the protocols of that meeting, and we also, I think you were from the at ZFS, one of the people who initiated this discussion as well. And we had basically 2 points that we felt you didn't have good enough answers to at the moment. And that is, how can we protect our authors' intellectual property when they send their do file out somewhere and they don't know what's happening? And I think that raises an issue of research ethics and of accountability, and it raises an issues of, first of all, who's really qualified to say that's the one right model? And I would say there's hardly ever one right model. I think there should always be 3 or 5 models that you all need to really understand a problem, a substantial problem in sociology. But also, how can we make sure, and that was of course the idea of what you're saying, that the authors who share their do files are really cited when their do files are used? And how can we make sure, and I have an anecdote of that replications that are done are not merely pseudo-replications, or are basically replications and then the do files are used to do a related but different study, and then people might introduce a lot of errors by thinking, oh, this is a great do file, oh, maybe you have made it, so I'm pretty sure you did it right. I have a related question, so all the design decisions you made, which might have been great on your research questions, how can we make sure that if I'm a junior scholar with no tenure under pressure, might not be tempted to use this. And I'm trying to raise these issues because, of course, I have anecdotal experience that these things do happen as well. And of course, we can, say we have to be honest and we have to be open with what we do. And of course, we don't steal people's work without citing it. But I'm not sure we really have the procedures to follow up on that. And this is one of the things I would like to raise. So the second point I would like to make, and then the anecdote on the side of a replication, I had this colleague, somebody really established in the community, older person, who told me, I had a student replicate one of these studies by that person, and he also shared the do file, and I think she was an undergraduate student, and she got exactly the same results. Well, what might that mean? She might just have executed the do file, and maybe she got a 1+ for it, for just pushing a button. And from the conversation, my impression was, depending on how intensely that replication was supervised, I wasn't sure whether that might be part of the miracle. At the same time, I have, of course, also made students replicate studies. There was, and I laid open, there was this Mandl and Semyonov paper on the welfare state paradox, and I was always struggling with how they typed Germany, and I said, there must be something wrong. But I never would have thought at that time, because it was really like, I think in the 2010s or so, that I had a student replicate this. I said, this is the data set. This is the secondary data sources. On a national level, you need to, construct that index. And I had a student really redo the whole analysis as part of their, or as her thesis. And it actually turned out Mandl and Semyonov were right. But the students had all done it by herself, and she had learned a lot in terms of data preparation. She also learned a lot about what had not been documented by Mandl and Semyonov properly to really always understand what they've been doing. But I think this is the type of replication that I think we really need more of, because this is where we learn a lot, and also maybe then if you don't end up with the same results, engage in discussions. And rather than saying, this is wiki thing, download the thing, and then you might end up having the same coefficient up to the 4th digit. And this is what always gets me a bit nervous. The second point I would like to make is, in my view, and this might be a little different from Josef's view, reproduction is a diagnostic tool that something's wrong with a paper, or maybe with a whole series of paper addressing an issue. But it's not the cure in itself, as I see it, or at least not yet. It is a diagnostic tool to see there's either a methodological error that somebody made, for instance, using a wrong way of using a vignette, or maybe it's very obvious to mess up in the data structure. But more often, because we, of course, at the Kölner Zeitschrift get these replication studies and publish them in terms of commentaries to papers. Very often, the real source of the problem, and I think your recent work is a good example of that, is that there's a conceptual misspecification or something that people overlook conceptually, and this is why a certain variable didn't enter the final perfect model. And I think this is something, of course, you can diagnose using reproduction, but it's much easier to overlook if you just have somebody do it who likes to crunch data. I think you really need people working themselves into the substance in order to make sure that they really got it more right than the original author. And I also have an example and anecdote from this, because there was this younger scholar who really had a good point on how, in the field that I'm interested in, like gender division of labor, how you should really specify relative earnings as the negotiation chip variable differently from how we've been doing that for a long time. But then in his analysis, he did the greatest thing. He used the ZÖP, which is a longitudinal database, which is essential if you want to mess with earnings data. It's the most endogenous type of variable you could think of in the field. But what he did is he pooled the data and treated it as a cross-section. And that is in the basis of what Becker already did wrong. Using cross-sectional data always would confirm Becker's thesis. but if you look at it longitudinally, it's just disconfirmed. And that again shows that, of course, even if people have a good idea and might be really right with something, if they haven't really thought through what it's substantially about and what it's really behind, they might even make much bigger mistakes, you know, put an elephant in the room that hasn't been there to begin with, just to correct, the picture wasn't quite right hanging there. And I think this is also something we need to be aware of. And as I said, I'm not saying this is all saying don't do replications. I think, yeah, do replications, but it's not only a data issue or it's not only a programming issue, it's really a conceptual issue. And therefore, it's also a thing we need to work on together. And I also think, because also our studies get replicated, when you work with the people who want to replicate it step by step, and we share our do files, but very often you still need to explain certain things to them. Well, maybe that's an indicator of not having documented them well enough, but I think it's really important to really engage. And this is, of course, something the more anonymized this replication process becomes, the more difficult that gets. And I'm not saying that's a reason not to do the replication wiki, not at all, actually, but this is what cautions me in this direction. The last point I would like to make, and I would like to link this back to our first Academy gathering, that was, I think, a really important opening that you two actually made when we met 1.5 years ago, was what are we really up for? Yes, we want to have reliable science. We want to say things about the world based on like evidence. And what at the moment really discredits sociology might be books selling extremely well who have actually read the literature but then claim, we're the Fahrstuhl Treppe downward society. So, and this is not a modeling issue. This is really an ethical issue and maybe sometimes also an intelligence issue, I don't know. But this is really the things that we need to really stand up against, and that what I thought this is what the Academy should stand for. With the replication, which I'm totally for, but we need to be careful who are the people we pick on. It's you in the room and me. So it's really, you look at the people who already try to do it as best as they can, even though they might not always be able to do. We all make mistakes. But we have to be a little careful not to discredit ourselves. And this is important also based on my experience as an editor. I'm not saying, don't say it, you made a big mistake, but don't mention it anywhere. No. But the tone is extremely important. And I did have people with very hurt feelings calling me as the editor of the Kölner Zeitschrift because they felt that their case was overstated or things, that the comment was about were really exaggerated by the person who, was pointing out maybe here and there you should have done things differently. And I think this aspect of tone and scientists being very, very sensitive people when it comes to their science and when it comes to their reputation, I'm certainly one of them, this requires even more. I had interesting conversations, and it already started with what tone do you accept in a review, even if it's, substantially right, a review for an article. You sometimes still have to say, please, can you say that in a different way? And please, can you not be so, negative about it? You can still be upfront, but it's really about how you say it. And in the replications and also other methodological contributions we receive on topics that are really important, we always have to deal with the authors and also the ones then concerned about finding the right tone and doing it in a way that really keeps us all together rather than dividing us over hurt feelings or over having not done it right. And these are, in my view, really important aspects, because the last thing we want is that we, hit on each other's heads because we replicated each other's studies. I think this is really important things we need to discuss and keep in mind as well. And I would expect a platform that really, collects these do files to really make sure that these principles are also really known. And I give you a last anecdote, and then I'm done with my 5 cents here. we had I'm also in the Prüfungskommission, so where all the plagiates and everything shows up. And we actually already had, even though we have an ethics education at the University of Frankfurt, a case where a student who attended a seminar used the do file of a colleague and just changed his dependent variable. So everything I just said. And of course, that student was dumb enough not to change the description of the do file. So it was very clear that that was stolen. But of course, the student still thought, oh, I really wasn't aware of this, so I didn't think it matters so much. And we also talked about it. So, I mean, he really shared this with me. And this is just to show you, we just start thinking about research ethics, and we put a lot of pressure on our junior scholars to produce high-level output in a very, very short time. And I think it demands a lot from them to be better than the people who have maybe studied a certain field, and to really consider all these things in the choices they're making. And the easier it is to use somebody's do file in a very anonymous way and use it for other purposes, or forgetting to cite it because I was so busy. I mean, that might create additional problems that we have not thought about. And so even though I really think we need to engage in this discussion and we need to professionalize in replication and reanalysis, and I'm doing it myself and I completely commit to it myself, I would also like to raise these points to which I don't think we have a good answer as an academy yet. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for your statement. And this gives us the opportunity, in my view, to directly integrate the audience into our discussion, I think.
Thank you. I don't know where to start. There are so many points. The fact that somebody has called you as the editor of the Kölner to complain about something indicates that this was a senior researcher, probably not a junior researcher. And I think the problem is that we need a generational change. Yeah? And the old generation is not used to do replications and open science and so on. And I think this is a symptom we will see for a while, but then at some point it will disappear. And this is also necessary that it disappears because it puts also a young researcher into a disadvantage that these standards are introduced now, whereas your careers were not based on these standards, and you should not forget that. Yeah? I think. And in general, I completely agree that a dialogue is necessary between the researchers of the original study and the ones doing the replication. That's really, really necessary, because this is not about making accusations or pointing fingers at people who did something wrong, because as you said, we do all make mistakes, but it's about finding maybe not the truth, but the right effect that has certain relevance. And but what I kind of was struck or unclear about was, or I think an important point that went between you, Daniela, and Joseph, was the distinction between conceptual reproductions and model specifications. So, although I felt that with Joseph's statements, I felt that there was a lack of reference to theory, which is also very important in replications. If we don't pre-specify hypotheses that we stick to and then test, we can always try to find the best fitting model, and we run the risk of over-specifying and then have even a wronger model than we would have had otherwise. So I think this distinction was not entirely clear, but I think the two of you had an interesting point there to talk about. So, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for raising the theory point. I couldn't agree more. This is really what it's about. Sometimes not. Sometimes it's really about technical things, but sometimes it's really about the theory not being right, not being thought through. About your first point, and your cohort of, you know, newer and younger PhD students, I could be a bit polemic and say, yeah, you have to deal with replication. We had to deal with computers that, well, my data preparation is stored on so many diskettes, and my documentation of it is still in my shelf. And so we all face different obstacles, of course. I'm not saying that to make your point smaller, but maybe to be very clear, the paper and what this particular phone call was about, but that is not the only type of exchange we have with authors who are unhappy in the way their work is represented in, you know, replications or methodological points that are made in the Kölner. That was really a paper from a PhD study. And what the person said, and there is actually, this is a debate that's currently going on in the Kölner, that the person who, you know, tried to make a methodological point picked out 2 papers from the Kölner who have dealt with that problem, but they were actually the good ones who actually did it right if you closely look at it. But if you only read the replication, or it's not really a close replication, it's more, you know, pointing to a problem, a misspecification that people do, these papers were actually wrongly accused of that particular point. And this is what I really see rather often, that authors who do replications or who criticize a certain article, they do tend to overemphasize the problem to make the, you know, storm seem bigger and more dramatic than it, when you really closely look at it, it really turns out being. And you often see that, and this is why we have these exchanges in the Kölner Zeitschrift, because the people that get basically criticized in these comments, they have the chance to, well, answer to this and you know, take position. And I think this is what we need, both to get the perspectives both in, but also to put certain problems to size. And I, as an editor, I see these problems in the fields that I'm knowledgeable about. But for certain publications, I wouldn't know whether this is now, you know, presented in the right way. So there's a lot of responsibility also for not putting our authors on display who have nevertheless undergone a review process by peers that have thought everything's in order. And so I think it's very important to keep in mind how to be fair to both sides. And so to put that point, yeah, now she's a senior researcher, but it was about one of her PhD study papers.
Thank you, Josef.
Yeah, thank you for your comment, but I simply had no time to mention it. For sure, a reanalysis finding the correct specification always needs theory. Without theory, you are lost, for sure, yeah. Yeah. So that's the reason why some people, as you did, name this conceptual reproduction, yeah, because you need theory. And the other point that you mentioned, I'm also fully in accordance with your argument. Probably no replication, no reanalysis is better than bad reanalysis. I think so. Yeah. And therefore, for sure, we need quality reanalysis. And how can we achieve this? For sure, okay, we will make a new guideline, academic guideline on doing good replications. Yeah? And by the way, we have already a preliminary document for this, because we want to approach the journals to institutionalize reproductions, to perhaps to make an editorial statement. And for sure, the journals should have a guideline saying authors how a quality reproduction reanalysis should look like. And we will provide you.
Both is fine, thank you. This point has been mentioned earlier. I think that this whole scientific process is a process of a community. So it's not just one individual who has a hypothesis tested and one individual attacking that. It's a community working on that. And I feel that in the social sciences we are not thinking like this. In other fields where we have multiple teams interested in the same research question, someone runs an experiment, then the whole community is replicating it. And once this is done, the community kind of decides what is true and not. And I feel that we lack the institutions for that. Yeah? If we publish our papers in various journals, it's difficult to link, or if we publish something, we are not sure whether readers actually see that we refer to certain things. And there, something like this wiki seems like a very plausible, very good tool. Yeah, where I'm interested. Oh, that's my phone. And, if you want to find out who did a certain kind of research, you just can go to this wiki, see who replicates, how did people perceive that replication, was the replication replicated, things like this. And I think journals should be more open to that. Journals have the great advantage that we have editors, people who make sure that people are not writing in rude ways, that they also always specify how they changed methods and so on. So I really think that in order to make this a more collective process, journals need to change and should be more open to debates.
That's absolutely true. I agree, and this was one of the reasons why the Zeitschrift für Soziologie several years ago changed the policy, or made a data policy that is now effective, saying that data should be there for replication studies, and replication studies are also welcome to be published there. That's very important. I would add one aspect, that a replication study could really add to the knowledge that we gain from doing social science research. That means that you can think about the contexts, under which this study was done. Maybe the context only means that you vary the set of covariates that you use, or the selection of cases or something like that. And this is also something that helps you better understanding what is going on with your data that you are analyzing, and the data represents the social process you are interested in. So I think replication, only doing this, pushing a button, this is a reproduction, and of course it should work, but it is not of such a great value for us when we think about scientific progress. So I would say this replication idea and open science in the sense we are talking about it should really foster this collaboration of researchers. And this also needs what you mentioned, communication, communication between people. It's not the question that we found that we are going out to find some errors in the papers other people made. This might also be necessary in some cases, but it's more interesting to see how we learn from this process, bringing the analysis further on by communication with the original authors and so on. So I think this is also in line with Josef's ideas, I would say. Jan, would you like to say something?
Yeah. I have two short comments on what was said before. One is, it was mentioned that the journals should take a role and maybe publish more replications and enforce more transparency. I think another role that could be played is by the funders. There's more and more funders who say, if you want our money, you have to publish in open access journals. The same should hold for, if you want our money, you should publish your data, you should publish your code, and you should describe how to use it together. Another point that was raised, I completely agree that very often in replications the tone is completely inappropriate. Also in the replies, I've seen cases that I find totally scandalous. I wonder there why the editors didn't say, sorry, we won't publish that, because it's just not scientific to write in that style. The reason behind that is science is way too much personalized. I mean, the way we cite already is we cite the name and then the year. The name doesn't say anything about what the research is about. So unless you know the context. But that's, for example, why in the replication wiki we chose to name the pages by the title of the article and then the journal and the year. Because like that we think it helps a bit to come away from this fact that people have to defend their research at any cost, even if they know that there's something wrong, because their career depends on that. And the same for the replicators. The importance of a replication is very often measured by, did they find something new? As was said, there's a big publication bias on that. And I think if, for example, there is this relevance rating, I took that from psychologists. In psychology, there was a page, the Psych File Drawer. They had this rating of which studies should be replicated. If we have that, we can, for example, better persuade journals to publish something.
Yeah, there is one other question or comment from the audience by Anita.
Yes, thank you. I have no idea if I have an opinion on the replication discussion, but I think I might add another point. I come from a very interdisciplinary background, and I work with psychologists and also a lot in the health sector, where replication studies are very common. But which is even more rising are meta-analysis, like doing, and I want to come back to the first point you raised. It's not always not the code we want to share, but I think we have to discuss about how to share the data. And especially when we think about the topic we meet here in this conference, we meet about digitalization, which is so multidimensional, and often very small studies are done. And if we find a way to pool data from smaller studies, maybe we can make more contribution to our questions and to our science. And I would like to have also a discussion about how can we build like an archive or something where we can collect, or maybe also find a standard for those case studies we also had in this conference, that we can run meta-analysis over them and then maybe have something more in the direction of representativity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for this comment.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting discussion. I just had a quick follow-up for that last point. I think since we're talking so much about digital data, one of the biggest issues is actually that these data are not available for replication. I mean, there's a lot of people who try this all the time. Even if you index, for example, with unique IDs, things like tweets, half a year later, half of them are gone. So we can never actually replicate this work anymore. And we are not allowed to, because I've received a cease and desist from Twitter in the early days. You're just not allowed to share the raw data, and you're not allowed to archive it. So even having an archive of a lot of these digital data, unless they're collected in the public domain and they're anyway available, is technically not feasible. And I think this is something to really think about. How can we guarantee replicability in an age where the raw data is either not accessible at all, it's firewalled, sometimes you just run it against a data that you don't even have access to, or you have the data, the raw data, but you're not allowed to share it. So I think that puts a pretty hard boundary on this kind of pure replication. The conceptual one, absolutely. But I think actually having data, rerunning analysis, having these kind of broad meta-analysis, that might just not be possible.
Yeah, thank you. This is also a very important point you raise here. And then short comment by Josef.
In fact, GESIS is undertaking big efforts to build up such an initiative for big data archive and the ethical and practical problems that occur with this. And the other point, that these data are usually proprietary. What the American Economic Review data policy does in this case is to try to implement the Treuhänder solution. I don't know the English word. So at least somebody besides you must have seen the data and verified that it works. The Times, that's trust declines in science. And we do not trust you anymore if only you have seen the data.
So for time reasons, we have one more comment or questions from the audience, and then I give the panelists the opportunity for a short statement to end the discussion. We already are 10 minutes over our time limit with these video streaming. Hopefully people are still interested in our fabulous discussion. So, Wojtek.
Okay, maybe you can combine the answer with your final statements, because this panel is about open science. So this is not only open data, but so there is another idea like open peer review. This could mean many things. That one is that the peer reviews are published alongside with the article, but still keeping the reviewers anonymous, or revealing everything, meaning also the names of the reviewers, which is currently done, for instance, in Frontiers in Psychology, for example. So I was wondering in how far you three think that open peer review will help to promote that process of open science, replicability, and finding the truth or the best way to do things. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. So who wants to start the final round here at the panel? Jan?
Yeah, I think this open peer review idea is a good one. I like it, but it has also the problem that, I mean, you are in a context of other researchers who you depend on, because they will also review you and they maybe decide on your career later on. So maybe you will adjust your reviews if they are open with your name to that condition. And I think it's a good idea, but it needs some thinking how to implement that well. I have an open, I had a review to do that I could have done open, and I decided not to reveal my name, but actually I'm not sure if the other reviewers could see it, but I think it's not, I had one where it's open to everyone, and another one where it's just available to the other reviewers, and I could decide if I wanted to give my name. In the end I did it because I saw that although the paper was extremely erroneous, it was already cited. And then I said, maybe you should warn those who cite you that there's this issue in your paper. I think that should be up at the moment to the reviewers. Maybe someone finds a system where this problem can be solved.
To speak for the Kölner Zeitschrift in this respect, we do reveal the name of all our reviewers once a year, but we do not connect the reviewers to the papers they've reviewed. So there is some transparency in that respect. And the second thing that we're doing, which I think goes in this direction without the pitfalls of, two people beating each other up, is of course we as reviewers also say which of the points in the reviews we find important, and we also make our own points. So the authors know which points the editors have been raising, so they know whom to hold accountable for. And having been a PhD student not that long myself, or not such a long time ago myself, this idea of fully open peer review has a risk of senior people, making people look small because they don't have their PhD yet. And as a person having experienced this in open scientific debates where we looked face to face at each other, I see problems with it. So sorry, I'm a personal skeptic on human behavior, but I've just seen so much of it, and I think there's something good in it if let's say a PhD student or a young scholar criticizing the big wig in some ways and having really good points, because this is the only way to make sure the better argument wins. And rather than saying, oh yeah, that small person, well, what does she or he have to say? And I'm just saying that because, I experienced it a lot. I know other people who experience it. It's not like it's not there. So let's not be naive about our scientific community as together we try to be, but sorry.
I cannot say anything about open peer review because I have not thought about this, but my impression is that we have quite a different problem with the peer review system. Namely, it doesn't work anymore, really. What I hear from editors, I'm not an editor, but I hear it from others, is that reviewers tend to invest less and less time into reviews. Yeah? So simply saying, oh, great paper. If you look at the paper, only 10 minutes you see many big flaws. the peer review process needs to go into another direction. Yeah? Be it paid reviews, I don't know, because seeing it systematically, what I told you with the reanalysis, an alternative could be that the reviewers do the reanalysis. But not only the reproduction, that's done by the data editor, and it's comparatively less time consuming, but doing a reanalysis takes much time. And yeah, so I'm not sure if we should go into this direction, but yeah, only as a thought.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all in the audience for being here to this very interesting and, for me, partly even enlightening discussion. And yeah, thank you to the panelists, of course. This was a great discussion. Thank you for being here. And yeah, it's hard to wrap it up very shortly. It's I think we need institutional changes. We need initiatives like Jan Höfler's Wiki for replications. We need to think more about the ideas to make our social science more reliable, as it already is. But it is not that easy as it appears to be to some one in the discussion process. So it's really worth to think about it and to come up with conclusions and solutions that help us in supporting to reach this goal to make better social science in the future. Thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. And we see each other very soon in the Il Boccone restaurant for the conference dinner. And hopefully you make your way shortly. And thanks again to all here.